Yes, Elf, I'm playing the baby horror game, but I didn't download it because, well, I downloaded it last night. I started to anyway, but then this morning I was like planning on getting up and then starting the download again, but obviously I'm like a procrastinator, so I didn't. And then we went to Whataburger and got a whole bunch of stuff, and then now I'm like late for stream and it's not even downloaded. It's got 1 minute 30 though. I had to take a pre-stream poop. Why is my chat box weird? Oh, it's locked. I've had this game for so long, and I literally haven't played it. Baby game not working, so we're playing Dead by Daylight. You want to play Dead by Daylight later? You? No? No? Okay.
I already uninstalled that shit.
I thought I uninstalled it too, but apparently I didn't. Hurry up. Oh my god. Why is this taking so long? It's literally flatlined. Totally flatlined. Why is this happening? Why is Steam being lame? That's what I want to know. Why is Steam being lame? What's going on? Are we gonna have to watch scary videos while we wait for this to download? Is that what we're doing? We're waiting for this shit to download. I'd like to say that my grandfather was a nice man, but I can't. I mean, he was nice to my family and me, but that wasn't all that there was to him. The thing I remember most about my grandfather was his ornament collection. In his later years, he lived in my family's house in a room upstairs. He kept that ornament collection under his bed in several wooden chests with locks, kind of like the chests where you keep the dinner silverware. Each ornament was kept in one of those protective styrofoam meshes you see on pears in a grocery store. Inside the box, each ornament was separated from the others with a foam divider. Grandfather called them rooms. I once asked him why he went to such lengths to protect the ornaments. He told me that each of the ornaments was a promise he broke. Every time he broke that promise, he got a new ornament or two to remind himself not to do it again. I remember seeing our Christmas tree covered in his shiny globe ornaments, little blinking lights nestled amongst the globes, seeming to set the tree ablaze in beautiful reflections. I remember putting my hand into his and telling him that I had never seen so many broken promises in my life. He smiled and told me that it was only one promise broken 100 times.
At that age, it seems silly. How could you break the same promise over and over? My sister and I grew older, went to college, settled down with our own families. My grandfather died last Tuesday. We held the funeral service on Friday. On Tuesday of this week, everyone went to the reading of the will. My older sister Lisa was there with her husband. She had asked me what I thought I was getting. I shrugged and told her that I thought our parents would get everything. My grandfather did leave everything to my parents except those ornaments. To my granddaughter Charlie, I leave you my ornaments. I leave you my broken promise. Everyone stared at me then, but I understood. It was a pure moment a grandfather shared with his granddaughter. I took home 6 wooden boxes filled with ornaments. There were 12 ornaments in each box, 72 in total. When I got home, my son Ben asked me what was in the pirate chests. I smiled and I told him treasure. He got this huge grin on his face and started hopping back and forth on each foot. I handed Ben the key and let him figure out how to open the chests. I think that's important, letting your kids figure out things for themselves. I guess that's something for a different time, though. So Ben got one of the chests open and picked up one of the ornaments. He handed it to me, holding it carefully in both hands, looking like a servant handing a queen something valuable. He said, "You can have my treasure, Mom." It was a pure moment a mother shared with her son. I reached for the ornament, but it slipped from my fingers, shattering into a million pieces on the tile. My son bent down and picked up something the size of his own finger. He held it up to me and asked, "What's this?" My son held what looked like a petrified stick. At the tip was a bit of chipped pink paint. I broke 5 more of the ornaments and found 2 more child-sized fingers. The other 3 ornaments held something else. A small length of fishing line with a hook tied to the end hung down inside each one. On each hook was a dried, spherical bit of meat with a small, dried stalk. I want to believe that they're dried eyeballs. I need to believe this because the other option is just too horrible to think about. I held every other ornament in each box up to my ear and shook it. There was something inside all of them. 72 ornaments. I loved my grandfather and did the only thing that I could. I wiped all of the ornaments down and put them under my own bed. I'm keeping them for holiday season. So, if you happen to be shopping for gifts this Christmas and spot a single mismatched ornament on the store's Christmas tree, just try to ignore it. It's just one of my grandfather's broken promises.
I've always loved the movies. As a film fan, my attention would instantly snap to the TV when I caught a commercial for an upcoming horror movie. Most of the mindless, overproduced garbage Hollywood churns out is pretty forgettable, so whenever I discover an indie film with a relatively fresh concept, I was excited to see something different.
Recently, I caught a commercial for an upcoming limited release thriller called Quiet Room, which I found pretty intriguing. The story features a serial killer with a twisted sense of morality who picks his victims based on what he feels they add or detract from society, and his killing methods reflect on how they've hurt others around them. I've only seen 2 different TV spots for this movie. Both are pretty similar, with just slightly different narration and video. However, one night while watching SportsCenter, I saw a new TV spot for a Quiet Room that I'd never seen before, and I found to be absolutely chilling. It opened with the title in white on black background, which was displayed for about 5 seconds. That led to a second screen of similar text, which simply said, "I'm coming," centered on the screen. The text was accompanied by the sound of several people quietly sobbing. Upon looking closer, I could make out about 6 dark silhouettes of people in the background. There were no film clips in this spot, nor were there a coming soon to theaters message. I found this to be pretty unsettling, but probably a viral marketing tactic. So I watched some cartoons to kind of settle my mind so I can get to sleep. The next day, I ran into my friend Jeff. We decided to have lunch together. Our conversation eventually led to the bizarre and the creepy commercial I saw during SportsCenter. I was shocked to hear that Jeff had also been watching SportsCenter last night, but didn't see the same commercial. Instead, he saw one of the original TV spots. I protested and described it in detail, but he had no clue what I was talking about. Naturally, this left me a little rattled regarding what I saw, but a few days elapsed and I found myself settling back into my normal routine.
Lord Jesus. Why is my computer being such a creep right now? Oh, my back popped. Oh no, just play it, thank you. Just play my game, thank you. Oh my god, why is Wake Up Theater being so lame? Oh, why? Hi, this is me live where you're watching my freaking my damn Steam channel thing. Holy hell. Oh, Dead by Daylight. Oh no, it's not. Hell. It's downloading pretty quick. Kind of. I should have did this way before. I thought I had auto updates turned on. I guess not.
I'd like to say that my grandfather was a nice man, but
I've already
I can't.
listened to this book.
I mean, he was nice to my family and me, but that wasn't all that there.
This one.
I'd like to say that my grandfather.
I like to say that my grandfather was very nice to me, but he wasn't. My voice sounds so different back then.
She's asleep by the time I get home. With all the overtime hours I was clocking, work kept me until the witching hours. I quietly took off my shoes and locked the door behind me. Suitcase on the couch, jacket on the chair, my tie loosened. I was home. I made my way up the stairs, wincing with every creak of the rotted supports. I made a mental note to fix them. Slowly, I turned the knob to our bedroom. She was fast asleep, bundled up in the duvet. I leaned over and kissed her gently on the forehead. Not a stir. She was always such a heavy sleeper. I crawled into the bed beside her, exhausted from the day's work. The phone gently buzzed in my pocket, letting me know it was time to wake up. I did so, and Eva gently crawled out of bed. I kissed her on the forehead again and made my way out of the bedroom. Suitcase in my hand, jacket on my back, my tie tightened. I was ready for work. I love her so much. But I know one day I'm gonna have to bury her.
One day, my fiance said that something was bothering her. My fingers are too long and slender. They make her feel like the Grim Reaper touches her at night. So, I took a knife and chopped them one by one to be half as long. The bone showed a lot of resistance, but I got through after a few strong chops. My love sat with me the whole time, sharing my pain and telling me how much she appreciates what I do for her. And we were happy. As I pet her with my stump, she looks at me and says that my eyes are asymmetrical, and it bothers her because it makes me look judgmental. So I took a spoon and dug out my smaller eye, leaving a dangling eyeball that I cut with scissors. That was the most painful part, but I don't want my love to feel judged. My fiancé cleaned up the mess and afterwards came to hug and comfort me. We were happy. A few days later, she said that my accent bothers her. It's too foreigner for her taste. So I took the scissors again and I cut my tongue so my speech wouldn't bother her ever again. It took 2 tries to cut it completely, but it was worth the pain. And we were happy. I came home from work. Everyone is worried, but they just don't understand. I found a letter on our door from her. It said, "I'm confused. You're not the woman you used to be, and I'm not sure that I love the new you. I don't know if I'll come back. Wherever she is, she must be happy." My earliest memory is Christina sitting on my chest, pulling my hair and shouting, "Give it to me!" I cried and held my dolly tight. "Stop it," I said. "You're gonna hurt Priscilla." Christina grabbed my ears and pulled until I heard a ringing crack like glass breaking in my head. My grip loosened from my polka-dotted dolly's dress. Christina pulled her away and ran out of the room giggling. "It's mine now, mine, and you'll never see it again." I ran to Mommy. "Christina took Priscilla," I said. "Calm down, dear. No one likes a tattletale. You can share your toys." "But Christina takes all my toys." "Oh, don't be so dramatic. Here, clean yourself up and get ready for lunch." She takes everything. I hate her. Mommy grabbed my shoulders. Don't ever talk that way about your sister. Do you understand me? That's a terrible thing to say. She loves you. At lunch, Mommy made me apologize for what I said. Christina grinned at me from across the table as I did. I think that's the moment that she knew she would always get away with it. I found Priscilla buried in the muddy rose bushes. A week later, her hair had been cut off and her arms and legs had been melted to a shriveled black. I sank my face into her rumpled dress and cried, "I'm sorry, Priscilla. I'm sorry I couldn't hold on to you." When I turned back to the house, Christina was smiling from the window of her room. Christina took more things from me as we got older. She found where I hid my toys and broke them with her friends. She stole my favorite clothes and told Mom they were hers. Once I invited a friend over for a sleepover, and Christina glared at her all night. She cornered her the next day at school and told her that she could sit at the cool girls' table if she stopped hanging out with me. And always that smile, that bright, toothy smile. Everyone always told her how beautiful it was, but that's only because they weren't looking closely enough. If they could only see what I saw. If only I could show them, just once. When I was 16, I fell in love. His name was Derek, and he sat next to me in biology. He was tall and painfully good-looking with an easy sense of humor. I was too intimidated to talk to him at first, but he had the kindness in his eyes that could make you feel totally at ease when he spoke to you. No one could make me laugh like he did, and I left class every day beaming like the sunrise. I stopped by his locker one day as school was letting out, and I asked about the bio homework, but I didn't hear his answer. I wanted to ask him to the winter dance. My heart was throbbing and I couldn't catch my breath. He was so amazing. I was so boring, but I knew I could make him happy if I had the chance. He made the joke about our bio teacher and squeezed my elbow as he laughed. I opened my mouth to ask him when I saw Christina walking our way down the hall. I said goodbye hurriedly, and hopefully she hadn't seen. I looked up as we passed each other. I tried to hide it, but I knew she saw the quiver of fear in my eyes. I knew because I saw that smile. She was at his locker the next day, giggling and twirling her hair and touching his arms. A few nights later, I heard the step, step, step of her sneaking him up to the room. Mom was such a sound sleeper, but Christina's room was next to mine, and I heard everything. Every night after that step, 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 and then the muffled sounds I tried not to hear. One night, I waited at the bottom of the stairs for Derek to sneak out. He gasped when he saw me standing in the dark, but I told him not to be afraid. I untied my robe and dropped it to the floor. I looked down at the ground and told him that I could make him happy too. I stepped towards him, touched the back of his neck with a shivering hand, and leaned in. He pulled his neck back gently and pushed my shoulders away from him. As he was leaving, he looked back at me with pity in his eyes and said, "Don't worry, I won't tell her." When Mom died, she left the house to Christina. Everyone said it made sense now that she and Derek were married. I didn't need that big house to myself, did I? No, they said, it's better that I find a cozy little place just for me. Just for me. Christina posted pictures online, hundreds of them. I would scroll through them late at night and imagine myself in her place. Imagine that I was the one smiling in our old backyard, that I was driving the new luxury car, that I was vacationing in Europe, and that I was kissing Derek on the forehead every morning. Everyone was excited when they announced that they were having a baby. Her belly grew. In the pictures she posted pictures of crib shopping and prenatal yoga. She soaked up the comments and attention, talked about how grateful she was, how blessed she had been. At the shower, I sat in the corner of the room while all her friends chattered and laughed. She beamed that toothy smile to all of them. But now, and then, she glanced at me. I could see the truth. "Isn't it amazing?" One of her friends said to me. "This house, this life, that gorgeous doctor husband. God, everything just comes so easily to her, doesn't it? It must be so inspiring to have a sister like her." Inspiring, yeah. Very inspiring. Excuse me. I left the party and drove downtown. I sat in the parking garage and squeezed the steering wheel until my fingers got white. At nightfall, I left the car and walked the neon streets to a dingy bar I knew, glass after glass until I felt nothing. A scruffy boy with a beer belly and a football jersey staggered up to me. He reeked of cigarettes and old popcorn. I finished my drink. He would do. I stared at the wall until it was over. He finished inside me. "Don't worry, hon, I'm on the pill," I lied. He took my number, but I knew he wouldn't call. It didn't matter. A few weeks later, I went to the doctor and confirmed what I already knew in my heart. Soon, I wouldn't be alone anymore. Soon, I would have something that Christina couldn't take from me. That night, I dreamed of a little girl with blue eyes and a pretty polka-dotted dress. "Priscilla," I whispered. When I woke up, "I'll name you Priscilla." Christina wouldn't get a chance this time. I would carry my child unseen and deliver her in secret. Afterwards, I would use all of my savings to move across country. "We have no family, Priscilla," I would say. "You have no aunties or uncles, but it's okay because I'll love you extra to make up for it." I dreamed of her again. She looked up at me with those sparkling blue eyes, clear and innocent. I held her close, tickled her, kissed her. She giggled and cooed, and my heart was so full it could burst. I loved her so much already, but when I looked up, I felt a flint strike fear in my heart. Christina was looking at her, smiling. I woke up shaking. "Please, no," I whispered into the dark. "Please, please keep away from my baby." Every night, the same dream. Every night, Christina was closer. I slept less and less until my brain was a lump of rotting meat. I could barely control my fingers to type at work. One morning, my boss called me into his office and asked me to take a leave of absence. I begged him to let me stay. I told him that I needed the money. I promised that I wouldn't make any more mistakes, but he just looked at me with pity, the same way that Derek looked at me, the same way the doctor looked, and the same way Christina's friends looked. I made my way home in a slow-motion fog. "Keep breathing," I told myself. "You'll figure something out. You have to, for her sake." I sat on the couch, shivering and feeling a heavy lump in my chest that seemed to be sinking down to my belly. I just needed to rest for a moment, rest and collect my thoughts. I closed my eyes. I held Priscilla, but her eyes weren't bright and playful anymore. They were shimmering with fear, and her skin was deathly pale. I looked up. Christina stood over us. She smiled, and rows of needle-sharp teeth glinted in the dark. She reached out, grabbed Priscilla's arm, and pulled. I screamed and held on. "Please, please stop. Leave us alone." Christina knocked me down and sat on my chest. I felt the weight of her bony body press into my gut. Priscilla's face retched in agony. Stop it, you're hurting her," I cried. Christina pressed forward into me, and I felt a stabbing pain in my middle. Christina's body twisted, her limbs bent like melted plastic. Her skin flaked off to show oozing red underneath, and with a final jerk, Christina pulled her away from me. I screamed myself awake. The room was dark and silent. Sweat soaked through my clothes, and my breath was quick and shallow. I rubbed my eyes. "Calm down, it was just a dream. See, you're all worked up over nothing. Everything's fine. Oh, wait. Something was wrong." I reached down between my legs and felt a thick, slimy goo between my fingers. I pulled up my skirt. In the moonlight, I could see a circle of black, a small, dark puddle soaking into the couch cushion. And in the middle of the puddle, my whole body went cold and empty. Everything was suddenly very tiny and far away. I could see something, but it didn't feel like it was what I was looking at. It felt like I was looking at a fuzzy picture from a great distance. My ears were ringing a high, melodic whine, tiny and distorted by the heaviness of my skull. After a moment, I recognized my phone's ring. I looked over at it, unable to make out the words on the screen. I picked it up from the table and swiped it open, smearing red across the screen. "Hello?" "Oh my God, sis, I'm so excited. I just have to tell you. So, you know how Derek and I have been going back and forth months on whether or not to reveal the sex of the baby? Well, I decided I couldn't take the suspense, and I asked the doctor to tell us during the ultrasound today, and guess what? We're having a girl. A girl. Yes, isn't that exciting? I mean, I was pretty sure it was a girl anyway, but now that we know for sure and we can finally decide a name, and I've thought long and hard about it, and Derek isn't too crazy about this one, but I want to name her Priscilla. You know, after the doll we used to play with when we were little. Do you remember? Priscilla. You're gonna name her Priscilla? Yeah, isn't that a pretty name? I think it's perfect. Derek will just have to name the next one. Anyway, I'm so excited and I wanted to share this with you first. And I also wanted to say that I love you, sis. I want you to know that. I love you and I'm sorry. I know that I wasn't always nice to you when we were growing up, and sometimes I think back on those days and I just feel such terrible guilt. I wasn't the big sister you needed me to be, and I want to change things. You're such a wonderful person, and I want you to be a part of my daughter's life. Oh gosh, this is me carrying on like I have fucking hormones. I'm sorry. I had to do this over the phone. It's just wonderful, isn't it? Life is so wonderful. Life is wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, it is. Well, listen, Derek's got a late shift at the hospital, so I'm going to have to try and get some decent sleep tonight without having to listen to him snoring. I'll call you soon, hon. Love you. I stared at the phone in my hand. I stared and stared. Everything she took, everything from me. I hate her. But no, you can't hate your sister. How dare you? She loves you. Don't you hear her say it? How can you say such a terrible thing about someone who loves you? Never say you hate her. Hate her. Hate. Driving across town in the moonlight. I could read the signs barely, but I knew the way to our home. Our home. My home. I was vaguely aware of another car honking and swerving out of the way. Nice car, expensive car, just like your sister, just like yours. I walked up to the driveway, the old house, dark and towering. I picked up a garden spade lying on the rose bushes. You buried her in those bushes, didn't you? You buried her there the first time you took her from me. Yeah, I remember everything. I walked up the stairs, step, silent and slow, just like you, Christina. I've learned so much from you. I reached the top of the stairs and opened the door at the end of the hall. Look at you sleeping so peacefully. No snoring to keep you up. Not tonight. I pulled up some old clothes from the hamper and tied them to the bedpost above her head gently, carefully. I tied her wrists to it. She moaned and squinted in the dark. Who's that, Derek? Hello, Christina. Her eyes snapped open. What are you doing here? She tried to pull her hands free, but they were secured tight. Relax, honey. I was so moved by your call tonight that I just had to come and tell you something. What's going on? Why am I tied up? Something very important. I want to know that you shouldn't feel guilty about how you were treating me when we were younger. You were perfect. I see that now. I hated you for so long, but now I realize that you were exactly the big sister I needed you to be. What the fuck? Untie me, you psycho. Do you hear me now? I know now why you kept taking things from me. It was to make me stronger. You pulled things away again and again so that I could get better at holding on to them. I understand now. You did it because you loved me. I held up the garden spade. Christina looked at it. Her eyes were huge and white in the dark of the room. What are you doing? Finally, I understand. You were always testing me, training me, making me better, and tonight was the final test. Tonight I get to show you how strong I've become. She trembled beneath me. I don't know what's going on. Please, put that down, okay? Just put it down and tie me and let's talk about it. I sat on her hips and looked at her powder blue face in the moonlight. My fingers squeezed the handle of the spade. Listen to me very carefully, Christina. All my life, you have taken things, my love, my home, my child. You've taken everything from me. I touched the tip of the spade on her swollen belly. But this time I'm going to take something back. I pressed the spade into her and I dug a chunk of flesh out of her abdomen. She wailed and thrashed.
and cursed with desperate power as I peeled the layer after layer away from her in wet ribbons. I dug and scratched until my arms were weak and burning, her screams like rusty nails hammering into my ears. Finally, I reached into the glistening sack and tore a hole in it. I ripped it open with my fingers and reached in to feel a squirming life inside. Christina wailed like a siren as I pulled that baby out of her sucking paw. I held my girl, my treasure, my little angel in my shaking hands, and I looked at her. She gleamed, purple and blue, twitching and wiggling, a new breath of life. I touched my face to her and cried. She was more beautiful than I could have imagined. "Hello, Priscilla," I said, kissing her slippery forehead. I stood up and looked down at Christina. She was choking and sputtering black liquid, her jellied insides spilling out onto the bed. I smiled at her, a beaming smile, her smile, a smile I finally understood after all these years. "Yes, thank you, sister. I see now that you're right all along. Life is wonderful." I carried my baby Priscilla across the hall to my old room, humming a lullaby. She was perfectly quiet and still, already so well behaved. A peaceful calm washed over me, and I curled up with her on the floor. I laid next to her in the dark for quite a while, closed my eyes, and I slept. I was halfway to the front door when I felt a barrel of a pistol pressed into my side. "Get back in the car," a menacing voice breathed into my ear. "Make a sound, and you'll be dead before anyone can reach you." The pizza box in my hand suddenly felt as heavy as lead. "Please don't do this," I whispered shakily. "Just take the keys out of my pocket and go." Instead, the man dug the gun so sharply into my ribs that I nearly gasped in pain. I turned and walked to the car as he followed closely and threatened to put a bullet in my brain if I tried to run. By the time I climbed into the driver's seat, my pizzeria uniform had grown damp with cold sweat. For the next half hour, I drove at gunpoint. My boss called me over and over again, right up until the man threw my still ringing phone out of the window. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, but I was too afraid of saying the wrong answer. "Well, I do now," he continued, undeterred by my silence, and flashed a smile that frightened me. "You walked into my life at just the perfect time." I thought about telling him that this was supposed to be my final night on this lousy job that made every shift feel like an eternity, and that I wanted nothing more than to go home and crawl into my bed and never so much as look at a slice of pizza again. But I knew I would only make him angry, so I kept my mouth shut and gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Finally, he commanded me to pull up to a secluded cluster of homes, where the man pointed towards a gray house with an empty driveway and grinned wickedly. "We're gonna wait for them to come home. Then you're gonna take that pizza box and knock on the door. When they open it and tell you they didn't order anything, I'll charge in." "Are you gonna hurt anyone?" I asked warily. He narrowed his eyes dangerously and my heart skipped a beat. "Just do what I say," he replied callously, "and then you can leave." But I didn't believe him. Time passed. The scent of tomato sauce and garlic hung heavy in the car's tense air. "I'm starving," he said, and reached inside the pizza box. He consumed 2 slices and was working on a third when I saw confusion flicker in his eyes. The gun slid from his grasp and he began to frantically claw at his throat, gasping desperately for air. Foam bubbled on his lips as he wheezed and convulsed. I watched as his accusatory glare faded away into a pale, lifeless blue, and just before my captor died, I spoke the last words he will ever hear. "It wasn't meant for you." Bedtime. It's supposed to be a happy event for a tired child, but for me it was terrifying. While some children might complain about being put to bed before they finish watching a film or playing their favorite video game, when I was a child, nighttime was something truly to fear. Somewhere in the back of my mind, it still is. As someone who's trained in the sciences, I can't prove that what happened to me was objectively real, but I can swear that what I experienced was genuine horror. A fear in my life, I'm glad to say, has never been equaled. I'm gonna relate to you all, now as best as I can. Make of it what you will, but I'll just be glad to get this off my chest. I can't explain exactly when it started, but my apprehension towards falling asleep seemed to correspond with me being moved into a room of my own. I was 8 years old at the time, and until then I had shared a room, quite happily actually, with my older sister. As is perfectly understandable for a girl 5 years my senior, my sister eventually wished for a room of her own, and as a result, I was given the room in the back of the house. It was a small, narrow, yet oddly elongated room, large enough for a bed and a couple of chest of drawers, but not much else. I couldn't really complain because even at that age, I understood that we didn't have a large enough house, and I had no real cause to be disappointed as my family was both loving and caring. It was a happy childhood. During the day, a solitary window looked out into our back garden. Nothing out of the ordinary, but even during the day, the light which crept into the room seemed almost hesitant. As my sister was given a new bed, I was given the bunk beds in which we used to share. While I was upset about sleeping on my own, I was excited at the thought of being able to sleep on the top bunk, which just seemed far more adventurous to me. From the very first night, I remember a strange feeling of unease creeping slowly from the back of my mind. I lay on the top bunk, staring down at my action figures and Barbies strewn across the green carpet. As imaginary battles and playtime took place between my toys on the floor, I couldn't help but feel that my eyes were being slowly drawn towards the bottom bunk as if something was moving out of the corner of my eye. Something that didn't want to be seen. The bunk was empty, impeccably made with a dark blue blanket tucked in neatly, partially covering 2 rather bland white pillows. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I was a kid. and the noise slipping under my door from my parents' television, it bathed me in a warm sense of safety and well-being. I fell asleep. When you awaken from a deep sleep to something moving or stirring, it can take a few moments for you to truly understand what's happening. The fog of sleep, it just hangs over your eyes and ears, even when lucid. Something was moving. There was no doubt about that. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. Everything was dark, almost pitch black, but there was enough light creeping in from the outside to outline that narrowly suffocating room. Two thoughts appeared in my mind almost simultaneously. The first was that my parents were in bed because the rest of the house lay both in darkness and silence. The second thought turned to the noise. A noise which had obviously woken me. As the last cobwebs of sleep weathered from my mind, the noise took on a more familiar form. Sometimes the simplest of sounds can be most unnerving.
Same.
A cold wind
I had weird dreams last night.
whistling
I
through a
felt
tree
like-
outside, a neighbor's footsteps uncomfortably
I have a lot of
close,
dreams
or
about malls, school,
in this case,
and like
the
cars
simple
or
sound
something. I'm just
of
playing
bed
this while I wait
sheets
for Dead by
rustling
Daylight
in
to
the dark.
update because it's just being forever. My Steam is
That
having
was
a-
it. Bed sheets rustling in the dark as if some disturbed sleeper was attempting to get all too comfortable on the bottom bunk. I lay there in disbelief, thinking that the noise was either my imagination or perhaps my pet cat finding somewhere comfortable to sleep that night. It was then that I noticed the door, shut as it had been as I'd fallen asleep. Perhaps my mom had checked in on me and the cat had sneaked into my room then. Yeah, that must have been it. I turned to face the wall, closing my eyes in the vain hope that I could fall back to sleep. As I moved, the rustling noise from underneath me ceased. I thought that I must have disturbed my cat, but quickly I realized that the visitor in the bottom bunk was much less mundane than my pet trying to sleep in, much more sinister. As if alerted to and disgruntled by my presence, the disturbed sleeper began to toss and turn violently, like a child having a tantrum in their bed. I could hear the sheets twist and turn with increasing ferocity. Fear then gripped me, not like the stubble sense of unease I had experienced earlier, but now potent and terrifying. My heart raced as my eyes panicked, scanning the almost impenetrable darkness. I let out a cry. As most young girls do, I instinctively shouted on my mother. I could hear something stir on the other side of the house, but as I began to breathe a sigh of relief that my parents were coming to save me, the bunk beds started shaking violently as if gripped by an earthquake, scraping against the wall. I could hear the sheets below me thrashing around as if tormented by malice. I did not want to jump down to safety, as I feared that the thing in the bottom bunk would reach out and grab me, pulling me into the darkness. So I stayed there, white knuckles clenching all my own blanket like a shroud of protection. The wait seemed like an eternity. The door finally, and thankfully, burst open, and I lay bathed in light, while the bottom bunk, the resting place of my unwanted visitor, lay empty and peaceful. I cried, and my mother consoled me. Tears of fear, followed by relief, streamed down my face. Yet, through all of the horror and relief, I didn't tell her why I was so upset. I can't explain it, but it was as if though whatever had been in that bunk would return, even if I had so much spoke of it, or uttered a single syllable of its existence. Whether that was a truth, I don't know, but as a child I felt that if the unseen menace remained close, like it was listening. My mother lay in the empty bunk, promising to stay there until morning. Eventually, my anxiety diminished. Tiredness pushed me back towards sleep, but I remained restless, waking several times momentarily to the sound of rustling bedsheets. I remember the next day wanting to go anywhere, be anywhere, but in that narrow, suffocating room. It was a Saturday, and I played outside, quite happily with my friends. Although our house was not large, we were lucky enough to have a long, sloping garden in the back.
We played there often, as much of it was overgrown, and we could hide in the bushes, climb in the huge sycamore tree which towered above all else, and easily imagine ourselves in the throes of a grand adventure in some untamed, exotic land.
As fun as it all was, occasionally my eye would turn to that small window, ordinary, slight, and innocuous. But for me, that thin boundary was a looking glass into a strange, cold pocket of dread. Outside, the lush green surroundings of our garden, filled with the smiling faces of my friends, couldn't extinguish the creeping feeling crawling its way up my spine, each hair standing on end. The feeling of something in that room watching me play, waiting for the night when I would be alone, eagerly filled with hate. It may sound strange to you, but by the time my parents ushered me back into the house for the night, I said nothing. I didn't protest. I didn't even make an excuse as to why I couldn't sleep there. I simply and suddenly walked into the room, climbed the few extra steps into the top bunk, and then waited. As an adult, I would be telling everyone about my experience, but even at that age, I felt almost silly to be talking about something which I really had no evidence for. I'd be lying, however, if I said that this was my primary reason. I still felt this thing would be enraged if I so much as spoke of it. It's funny how certain words can remain hidden from our mind no matter how blatant or obvious they are. One word came to me that second night, lying there in the darkness alone, frightened, aware of a rotten change in the atmosphere, a thickening of the air as if something had displaced it. As I heard the first casual twists of the bedsheet below, the first anxious increase of my heartbeat at the realization that something was once again in the bottom bunk. That word. A word which had been sent into exile, filtered up through my consciousness, breaking free of all repression, gasping for air, screaming, etching, and carving itself into my mind. Ghost. As this thought came to me, I noticed that my unwelcome visitor had ceased moving. The bedsheets lay calm and dormant, but they had been replaced by something far more hideous. A slow, rhythmic rasping of breath heaved and escaped from the thing below. I could imagine its chest rising and falling with each sordid, wheezing, and garbled breath. I shuddered. I hope, beyond all hope, that it would leave without occurrence. The house lay as it had the previous night, in a blanket of darkness. Silence prevailed, all but for the perverted breath of my as yet unseen bunkmate. I lay there, terrified. I just wanted this thing to go, to leave me alone. What did it want? Then something unmistakably chilling transpired. It moved. It moved in a way different from before. When it threw itself around in the bottom bunk, it seemed unrestrained, without purpose, almost animalistic. This movement, however, was driven by awareness, with purpose, with a goal in mind. For that thing lying in the darkness, that thing which seemed intent on terrorizing a young girl, calmly and nonchalantly sat up. Its labored breathing had become louder, and now only a mattress and a few flimsy wooden slates separated my body from the unearthly breath below. I lay there, my eyes filled with tears. A fear which mere words can't relate to you or anyone else coursed through my veins. I wouldn't have believed that this fear could have been heightened, but I was so wrong. I imagined what this thing would look like, sitting there listening from below my mattress, hoping to catch the slightest hint that I was awake. Imagination then turned to an unnerving reality. It began to touch the wooden slates from which my mattress sat on. It seemed to caress them carefully, running what I imagined to be fingers and hands across the surface of the wood. Then, with great force, it prodded angrily between two slates into the mattress. Even though the padding, I felt as though someone had viciously stuck their fingers into my side. I let out an almighty cry, and the wheezing, shaking, and moving thing in the bunk below me replied in a kind of violent vibrating, just like it had done the night before. Small flakes of paint powdered on my mattress from the wall, as if the frame of the bed scraped along it, backwards and forwards. Once again, I was bathed in light, and there stood my mother, loving, caring as she always was, with a comforting hug and calming words which eventually subdued my hysteria. Of course, she asked what was wrong, but I couldn't say. I dared not say. I simply said one word over and over again. Nightmare. This pattern of events continued for weeks, if not months. Night after night, I would awaken to the sound of rustling sheets. Each time I would scream so as not to provide the abomination with time to prod and feel for me. With each cry, the bed would shake violently, stopping with the arrival of my mother, who would spend the rest of my night in the bottom bunk, seemingly unaware of the sinister force torturing her daughter nightly. Along the way, I imagined to feign illness a few times and come up with other less than truthful reasons to sleep with my parents, but more often than not, I would be alone for the first few hours of each night in that place. The room where the light from outside didn't sit right, alone with that thing. With time, you can become desensitized to almost anything, no matter how horrific. I'd come to realize that for whatever reason, this thing couldn't harm me when my mother was present. I'm sure the same would have been said for my father, but as loving as he was, waking him from sleep was almost impossible. After a few months, I had grown accustomed to my nightly visitor. Now, don't mistake this for some unearthly friendship. I detested the thing. I still feared it greatly, and as I could almost sense its desires and personality, if you want to call it that, one filled with a perverted and twisted hatred longing for me of perhaps all things. My greatest fears were realized in the winter. The days grew short, and the longer nights merely provided this wretch with more opportunities. It was a difficult time for me and my family. My grandmother, a wonderfully kind and gentle woman, had deteriorated greatly since the death of my grandfather. My mother was trying her best to keep her in the community as long as possible, but dementia is a cruel and degenerative illness. It robs a person of their memories one day at a time. Soon, she recognized none of us, and it became clear that she would need to be moved from her house to a nursing home. Before she could be moved, my grandmother had a particularly difficult few nights, and my mother decided that she would go stay with her. As much as I loved my grandmother and felt nothing but anguish for her illness, to this day I feel guilty that my thoughts were not of her, but of what my nightly visitor may do should I become aware of my mother's absence. Her presence being the only thing which I was sure was protecting me from the full horror of this thing's reach. I rushed home from school that day and immediately wrenched the bed sheets and mattress from their lower bunk, removing all of the slates and placing an old desk of chest of drawers and some chairs which we kept a cupboard where their bottom bunk used to be. I told my father I was making an office, which he found adorable, but I would be damned if I'd give that thing a place to sleep for one more night. As darkness approached, I lay there knowing my mother wasn't in the house. I didn't know what to do. My only impulse was to sneak into her jewelry box and take a small family crucifix which I had seen there before. While my family were not very religious at that age, I still believed in God and hoped that somehow this would protect me. Although fearful and anxious while gripping the crucifix under my pillow tightly in one hand, sleep eventually came, and as I drifted off to dream, I hoped that I would awaken in the morning without incident. Unfortunately, that night was the most terrifying of them all. I woke gradually. The room was once again dark. My eyes adjusted. I could gradually make out the window and the door and the walls, some toys on a shelf. Even to this day, I shudder to think of it. There was no noise, no rustling of sheets, no movement at all. The room felt lifeless. Lifeless, yet not empty. The nightly visitor, that unwelcome, wheezing, hate-filled thing which had terrorized me night after night, wasn't in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Utter terror had shaken the very sound from my voice. I lay motionless. If I couldn't scream, I didn't want it to know I was awake. I hadn't seen it. I could only feel it. It was obscured under my blanket. I could see its outline, and I could feel its presence, but I dared not to look. The weight of it pressed down on top of me, a sensation I will never forget. When I say that hours passed, I don't exaggerate. Laying there, motionless in the darkness, it was every bit as scary and frightening as a young girl could be. If it had been during the summer months, it would have been light by then, but the grasp of winter is long and unrelenting, and I knew it would be hours before sunrise, a sunrise which I yearned for. Fear can sometimes wear you out, make you threadbare, a shell of nerves, leaving only the slightest trace of you behind. But I had to get out of that bed. Then I remembered the crucifix. My hand still lay under the pillow, but it was empty. I slowly moved my wrist around to find it, minimizing as best as I could the sounds and vibrations it caused, but I couldn't find it. I'd either knocked it off of the top bunk or it had... I couldn't even bear to think of it been taken from my hand. Without the crucifix, I had lost all sense of hope. Even at such a young age, you can be acutely aware of what death is and intensely frightened of it. I knew I was going to die in that bed if I lay there, dormant, passive, doing nothing. I had to leave that room behind, but how? Should I leap from the bed and hope to make it to the door? What if it was faster than me? Or should I just slip out of the top bunk, hoping to not disturb my uncanny bedfellow? Realizing that it hadn't stirred when I moved trying to find the crucifix, I began to have the strangest of thoughts. What if it was asleep? It hadn't moved so much as breathed since I had woken up. Perhaps it was resting, believing that it had finally got me, that I was finally in its grasp. Or perhaps it was toying with me. After all, it had been doing that for countless nights, and now, with me under it, pinned against my mattress with no mother to protect me, maybe it was holding off, savoring its victory until the last possible moment, like a wild animal savoring its prey. I tried to breathe as shallowly as possible, and mustering every ounce of courage I could, I reached over slowly with my right hand and began to peel the blanket off of me. What I found under those covers almost stopped my heart. I didn't see it, but as my hand moved the blanket, it brushed against something smooth and cold, something which felt unmistakably like a gaunt hand. I held my breath in terror as I was sure it must now have known that I was awake. Nothing. It didn't stir. It felt dead. After a few moments, I placed my hand carefully further down the blanket, and I felt a thin, poorly formed forearm. My confidence and almost twisted sense of curiosity grew as I moved down further to a disproportionately larger bicep muscle. The arm was outstretched, lying across my chest, with the hand resting on my left shoulder as if it had grabbed me in my sleep. I realized that I would have to move this cadaverous appendage, even so much as to hope to escape its grasp. For some reason, the feeling of torn, ragged clothing on the shoulder of this nighttime invader stopped me in my tracks. Fear once again swelled in my stomach and my chest as I recoiled my hand in disgust as a touch of scraggly, oily hair. I couldn't bring myself to touch its face, although I wondered to this very day what it would have felt like. Oh, dear God, it moved. It moved. It was subtle, but its grip on my shoulder and across my body strengthened. No tears came, but God, how I wanted to cry. And its hand and arm slowly coiled around me. My right leg brushed along the cool wall which the bed lay against. Of all that happened to me in that room, this was the strangest. I realized that this clutching, rancid thing which drew great delight from violating a young girl's bed was not entirely on top of me. It was sticking out from the wall like a spider striking from its lair. Suddenly, its grip moved from a slow tightening to a sudden squeeze. It pulled and clawed my clothes as if frightened that the opportunity would soon pass. I fought fought against it, but its emaciated arm was too strong for me. Its head rose up, withering and contorting under the blanket. I now realized where it was taking me. Into the wall. I fought for my life. I cried, and suddenly my voice returned to me, yelling, screaming, but no one came. Then I realized why it was so eager to suddenly strike, why this thing had to have me now. Through my window, that window which seemed to represent so much malice from outside streaked hope, the rays of sunshine. I struggled further, knowing that if I could just hold on, it would soon be gone. As I fought for my life, the unearthly parasite shifted, slowly pulling itself up to my chest, its head now poking out from under the blanket, wheezing, coughing, and rasping. I don't remember its features. I simply remember its breath against my face, foul and as cold as ice. As the sun broke the horizon, that dark place, that suffocating room of contempt was washed, bathed in sunlight. I passed out as scrawny fingers encircled my neck, squeezing the very life from me. I awoke to my father offering to make me some breakfast, a wonderful sight indeed. I had survived the most horrible experience of my life until then, and now. I moved the bed away from the wall, leaving behind the furniture I had believed would stop that thing from taking a bed. Little did I think that it would try to take mine and me. Weeks passed without incidents, yet on one cold frostbitten night, I awoke to the sound of the furniture where the bunk beds used to be, vibrating violently. In a moment it passed. I lay there sure I could hear distant wheezing coming from deep within the walls, finally fading in the distance. I've never told anybody this story before. To this day, I still break out in a cold sweat at the sound of bedsheets rustling in the night, or a wheeze brought on by a common cold, and I certainly never sleep with my bed against the wall. Call it a superstition if you want, but as I said, I can't discount conventional explanations such as sleep paralysis or hallucinations, or that of an overactive imagination, but what I can say is this. The following year, I was given a larger room on the other side of the house, and when my parents took that strangely suffocating, elongated place as their bedroom, they said they didn't need a larger room, just one big enough for the bed and a few things. They lasted 10 days. We moved on the 11th.
My dad used to say that he could see faces in the floor tiles. The ones in the bathroom specifically. I laughed and told him that that's a normal thing. It's called pareidolia, the tendency to see pattern where there is none, like seeing a cloud and thinking that it looks like a turtle. People see faces in inanimate objects all the time, within wood grains and ink blots, tea leaves and spilled paint. We see something where there is nothing. The Blessed Virgin in the grilled cheese, Jesus in a water stain under the sink. St. Peter in a quesadilla. I laughed. But after my dad passed away, I started seeing them too. On the floor tiles, not in quesadillas. They look angry, he had told me. And they're leaving messages now. I don't think this is pareidolia. They had really scared me for some reason. My dad was a smart guy. He already knew what pareidolia was, even if I thought I was teaching him something new. Like how when we watched Jeopardy, he already knew all the answers, even if I was the only one who said them out loud occasionally. So, when I started noticing the faces in the floor tiles after his death, I took note. I began to draw them, to write down the messages that they were sending as I tried to decipher their hidden meanings. I tried to not become obsessed with them as he had been before he died, before he drowned. The faces in the floor tiles didn't look angry to me. They looked happy, pleased with themselves. I thought it was fun at first, seeing the faces and reading the secret messages they left me, deciphering them. Not just the floor tiles, but increasingly in more and more places. The floor tiles told me to look out for the bike messenger, and on my walk into work I saw him coming and I stopped in my tracks. If I'd continue on, I wouldn't have been splashed a second later by the big puddle he veered into accidentally. I would have ended up covered in mud and my day would have been ruined. I grinned and walked into work, knowing that I had a special line to some power that had a few tricks up its sleeve. This had clearly been just a way to prove my abilities, and I wondered what would be next. The messages came again soon after, hidden in the patterns of the marble countertop in the kitchen at work. While stirring the cream into my coffee, I stared at it and tried to make it out. Just as I deciphered the message, someone said, "You all right there, George?" It was my boss. He was staring at me while I was mindlessly stirring my coffee, just as I had been doing for 5 minutes. I had also been speaking silently under my breath as I tried to make out the words in the hidden message of the countertop. "Oh, sorry, yeah, I just lost in my thoughts. What's up?" He shook his head and went over to the fridge to get another energy drink. As he walked past me on his way to the office, he muttered under his breath, "Really know how to pick 'em, don't you, Craig?" I'm pretty sure he's gonna fire me soon. Anyway, that message told me what to do next. They were online forums, it said. Places where I could learn more, places where I could find a community among the others who were able to see the messages, the faces. On the dark web, I found a hidden community and used the password given to me by the messengers in the marble slab. Further proof of the fact that this was real. The password worked. They permitted me to become a member of their organization, the Pareidoliacs. The secretive community had one purpose: to follow the directions set forth by the messengers to fulfill their commands. I became a valued member of the organization after I revealed that I had a talent for drawing the hidden faces and decoding their messages. Not everyone was capable of that. Most had to simply remember things as best as they could, since the faces never showed up in photographs. Soon, I was spending all of my time with the other members of the group online, decoding secret messages. My family wanted to know about my interests, so I told them about the group. They told me I was losing it, and that I needed to get help. It didn't matter how much I tried to convince them. They told me that it was nothing more than pareidolia, finding patterns where there was none. My mom booked me a session with a psychotherapist, just for a chat, she said, as I was taking my father's death too hard, and that my obsession with the faces was a delusion brought on by my PTSD, perhaps. Because of what I had witnessed the day of the pier, I told her she was wrong. I knew for a fact that she was wrong. She said I sounded just like my father. The next time I saw the faces in the patterned ceiling of a subway car, I noticed that they looked angry, They told me to go to the pier, to the same dock where it happened, and where he died. And so I did. Looking down into the inky black water from the rickety wooden deck above, I watched as the light shimmered and reflected off of the surface of the lake, making patterns where there were none, messages and faces, familiar faces solely missed and gone too soon. Join him. My foot stepped over the edge. I was just about to lean over and plunge myself into the cold, brackish waters below when I saw the face appear beside the words. No longer looking angry, but not smiling either. It looked hungry. I took a step back and scowled, shaking my head. I tried to clear my thoughts and remember why I was even there. Why was I doing this? The shimmering reflection of the moon on the water told me not to worry, not to fret, just to give in. And before I knew it, I was falling. Ice-cold water shocked me, and I felt myself incapable of movement as my mind blanked completely, unable to register the gravity of the situation I had just found myself in. I realized immediately I didn't want to do this. Whatever force had brought me here was the same one that killed my father. It had been deceiving me all this time, reeling me into the secret messages hidden in the tiles and the woodwork, in the marble countertops and patterned ceilings. The force of it pulled me down, grabbed me by the ankles, and took me under the surface, gulping down water instead of air, feeling immediately out of breath. My legs began to kick, and I started to try to swim up towards the surface of the ice-cold water. I managed to come up for air and coughed up a lungful of water and took a great gasping breath for air. Looking around were panicky, wide eyes. There was no one around this late at night, and the waves were high, and large one was just now about to break and crash down upon me. I held my breath and braced for impact. The wall of water crashed into me, and I felt my nose bloodied from the sudden hit. Water went up it as well, and into my airways, and I found myself plunged below and unable to expel it. I sank down, feeling heavy with the weight of my clothes, disoriented from the force of the impact of the wave. The water was reflecting in odd patterns, making it appear that up was down and down was up. Running out of breath, I struggled to find my way back to the surface, but could not decide which way to go. I picked the direction that felt right and kicked as hard as I could to try to get back to the air on the surface. I was terrified I would die, but at the same time furious, for I know that the entity that killed my father was attempting to do the same to me. Only now that I was about to die in the same watery grave where his body had been lost and never found, did I realize how foolish I had been. I cursed myself, remembering how I sided with the people from the message boards instead of my own mother, and I wished that I believed her when she said the pareidolia were nothing but trouble. That was when I saw the rope ladder suddenly appear beside me. I looked up and saw my mother standing on the pier, a worried look on her face. She was screaming at me and pointing at the rope ladder as I thrashed to struggle in the icy water. Grabbing onto the first rung I can get my hands on, I began to climb. Once I got out of the water, she told me that she had been worried that I had started to follow my father's footsteps, and that maybe the secret messages had hidden codes that brought me to the very place that had taken his life. She had brought the rope ladder from my childhood treehouse, thinking she might need it for some reason. A little voice inside her head said to bring it along, and she listened. He trailed off, breaking eye contact momentarily. To explain it. Essentially, you have a group of people who've spent their entire lives chained up inside a cave, all facing a blank wall. The prisoners watch shadows projected on the wall, by persons or objects behind them and out of their field of vision. The shadows are the prisoner's reality, but they're not accurate representations of the real world. They're merely projections, a false reality created by persons unknown for their own nefarious purposes. As Plato's story goes, one prisoner escapes from his chains and comes to understand the truth, that the shadows are not reality, and a whole world of light lies beyond the tight confines of the darkened cave. The escapee is astonished by his discovery and returns to tell his fellow prisoners the remarkable news, but he found they didn't want to hear the truth. The inmates of the cave have no desire to leave their prison, for they know a better life. In this allegory, the escapee is a philosopher, capable of seeing the greater truths of the universe, but the other prisoners are content with the limited and false reality they inhabit, and are unable or unwilling to learn the truth. As the saying goes, ignorance is bliss. I relate with the escapee in Plato's story, and with the nightmare he faces, having to live with too much knowledge and become an outcast amongst his peers. My life is eerily similar to his. I don't dwell in a cave, and I'm not in chains, not literally, at least. Instead, I live a comfortable existence in a modern home with my basic needs all catered to. I have parents who love me and try to protect me in their own way. Nevertheless, I'm a prisoner, cut off from the world and forced to live a lie. Sometimes, I wish I was like the other prisoners in the story, that I could learn to accept my fate and be content with the lot of my life. This is what my parents have done, but alas, I can find no peace. It doesn't matter how many times they ease my memory, I'll always feel the urge to break from my chains and seek out the truth, no matter how terrible it turns out to be. I'm telling my story now, before they come for me and take away my memories, wiping the slate clean. I don't know if anyone will ever hear my account. Probably not, but I still hold out hope that someday help will come and I'll finally be free from this living nightmare. It's hard to know where to start. I don't know how long I've been here. It could be months or years. The memory wipes make it difficult to keep track. I know that something existed before this, now, and then I experienced glimpses of my past life, my former identity, now erased from history. I'm not sure exactly what age I am. I would guess around 16 or 17. Still a kid, I suppose, although I feel like I've lived well beyond my years. The person who I call mother and father aren't my real parents. I know that now. They're not bad people, and I believe generally do care about me. Nevertheless, they are content to remain as prisoners here and to collaborate with our prison keepers. My surrogate father is a kind-hearted man, but has a passive nature, seemingly resigned to accepting things that are outside of his control. My mother has a similarly mild-mannered personality, although she does have a genuine maternal instinct, loving me like I was her own child, which, of course, I'm not. The house we live in is a luxurious one, with 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a modern kitchen, a spacious and open wide-plan lounge, a den, a games room, and a home office. We have all the basic amenities: electricity, heating, hot water, and nutritious food delivered daily. It's all very comfortable, and there's just one drawback. We can never leave. The house's windows, if you can describe them as such, are not transparent glass panes that allow us to view the outside world. Instead, we have screens projecting digital images of various scenes of great natural beauty: sandy white beaches beside clear blue seas, snow-tipped mountaintops, and rolling grass savannas, to name a few. The artificial scenes are played on a loop, or specific images can be picked, depending on one's mood. As stunningly beautiful as these are, I've always found these digital projections rather odd, something akin to the shadows on the cave walls in Plato's story. I've asked my parents about those images, inquiring why we can't have actual windows showing the reality of the outdoors. But they always brush away my concerns, saying not to worry about it, and how the images projected on the screen are far superior. We have a front door that doesn't open, not ever. Anytime I raise the issue of the door, my father becomes angry, telling me in no uncertain terms that I must ever approach it, and warning that I would be punished if I were to ever attempt to. Since we can't go outside, all of our food is delivered to us by a high-tech version of a dumb waiter installed in our kitchen. It's a bit like a larger version of a vending machine. We just type in what we want and it magically appears in the bottom of the chute moments later. You might as well ask where these supplies come from and who provides our sustenance. Well, this is a question my mother and father were unwilling to answer, and for one, I eventually grew tired of asking. I have no desire to starve myself, and so I eat the food, even though I've come to realize that there's something in it that affects my hormones and behaviors, taking away my desires and leaving me docile and compliant. Nevertheless, the drugs they force me to ingest do not entirely suppress my spirit or remove my thirst to discover the truth. My bedroom is my sanctuary, but also my prison cell. I have plenty of distractions to keep me occupied: music, books, game consoles, a widescreen television, and a huge collection of films and box sets. Nevertheless, I'm incredibly lonely, as I have no friends of my own age or no human contact with anyone other than my mother and father. What lies inside these four walls will never be enough for me, and I have spent countless nights crying into my pillow, dreaming of the world outside and the opportunities I would have. If only I could escape. Like I said, my memories are hazy due to the drugs and mind wipes, but I will recount as far back as I can remember in this current cycle, which is when Cain came to live with us. At the time, I had no idea who Cain was or where he'd come from. I simply remember walking up and coming down to the breakfast table one morning, and there he was, sitting at the kitchen table acting like he owned the place. I knew he was trouble the first time I set eyes on him, noting the dead look behind his dark eyes and deep scar along his left cheek. He was a large man and appeared to be physically intimidating. Later, after he stood up, I noticed how he walked with a heavy limp. It seemed as if he'd been through the wars and had the scars to prove it. As you can imagine, I was very shocked to see this newcomer suddenly appear at our breakfast table after all this time, and I opened my mouth to speak without thinking. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded angrily. I regretted my words as soon as I spoke them, as a grizzled newcomer glared back at me with hatred in his eyes and a cruel grin on his lips. He didn't answer, but instead, my mother rushed in from the kitchen counter, carrying plates filled with breakfast as she came. I noticed how her hands were physically shaking. Now, sweetie," she exclaimed nervously, as she hastily dropped the plates and dishes down on the table. "That's no way to speak to our new house guest. Mr. Kane is an old family friend, and he's going to be staying with us for a while. I want you to make him feel welcome and as comfortable for as long as he's here." I was confused and utterly flabbergasted. Nothing about this situation made any sense. An old family friend? A house guest? Why would this Kane suddenly appear now, after all these years of it just being the three of us? Why would I welcome a guy who looked like a total psychopath? I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could get a chance, my father marched in from the lounge and attempted to take control of the situation. "Listen to your mother, kid," he said. "We'll hear no more about it. Now, let's sit down and enjoy our breakfast." He tried to exert calm confidence in his voice as he spoke, but I knew my father too well, and I could tell that he was on edge. Nevertheless, I didn't feel inclined to argue in that moment, so I did as I was told and took my seat at the table. The breakfast was particularly tense after. My mother looked terrified throughout, keeping her head down and refusing to make eye contact with our guest. Father was also uneasy, keeping a cautious eye on Kane, like he expected the mysterious newcomer to kick off at any moment. I couldn't wait to get away from the kitchen table, and I ate very little, as my stomach was in knots. I don't think Kane even touched his food, and he didn't speak a word. With some concern, I noted how his predator-like eyes darted from side to side, as he looked over each one of us in turn, sizing us up. It was a great relief to get away from him, but of course we couldn't really avoid Kane, as all four of us were cooped up together inside this overgrown rabbit hutch. After breakfast, Kane went to sit in the living room lounge. He didn't speak, read, or watch TV, but instead parked himself in an armchair and stared out the window, seemingly captivated by the artificial intelligence screens, the shadows on the cave wall, if you will. We did our best to ignore Kane and go about our daily routines, but his mere presence produced an utmost unbearable tension. To be honest, I was still angry with my parents for not telling me the truth about Kane and his origin. Obviously, they knew a lot more than they were letting on. I took my dinner upstairs, not wishing to repeat the tension-filled experience of breakfast. Whatever drugs they put in my food did the trick, as I was able to calm down and eventually drift off to sleep. I awoke in the middle of the night to a loud crashing noise, closely followed by a muffled scream. Shooting up from my bed, I felt a wave of terror run through me, and an icy chill worked its way up my spine. I lay there, frozen to the spot, as more sounds followed, those of a frantic struggle occurring downstairs. I was terrified in that moment, as I imagined all the awful events that could be happening. Were my mom and dad fighting? Had Kane gone crazy? Or perhaps our mysterious prison keepers had finally turned on us, launching an assault upon our sanctuary. My first instinct was to hide under my covers and pray, but I knew that this would be futile. I wasn't a little kid anymore, so I needed to be brave. With considerable trepidation, I crawled out of my bed and carefully tiptoed across the bedroom floor in my bare feet, while still wearing my pajamas. I crept along the corridor and made my way down the staircase, taking great care with each step as I tried my hardest not to make a sound. As I descended, I could hear muffled cries interspersed with the sounds of heavy breathing and hard boots thumping upon the wooden floor. My stomach was in knots and my whole body was shaking uncontrollably, but I knew I must go on. Despite their faults and the lies that they told me, I still cared about my parents, and I needed to go to their aid. And besides, what else could I do? There was nowhere to hide and no means of escape. Ultimately, I had no choice but to confront the attacker. I proceeded with stealth through the kitchen, following the ominous and the disturbing sounds emanating from the lounge. Realizing I may need to defend myself, I carefully removed the sharpest knife from the block, holding the blade out in front of me to use as a weapon. When I entered the lounge, I was faced with a horrific situation. My mother and father were bound to chairs, their arms tied behind their backs and their mouths stuffed with gags. I saw the dried blood on my father's forehead and guessed he had received a nasty head wound, leaving him barely conscious. In contrast, my mother appeared to be entirely conscious but tightly bound. Her eyes filled with terror when she saw me, and she tried to shout out in warning, but the gag muffled her words. And then I saw him. Kane emerged from the shadows in the far corner of the room. It looked like he'd been there waiting for me this whole time, having used my parents as bait. He walked forward into the light, and I saw the crazed, homicidal look in his eyes and the cruel, sadistic smile etched across his face. And then I saw what he carried in his hands. An improvised club fashioned from one of those heavy legs from our kitchen table. Kane certainly looked strong enough to wield this weapon, and I reckoned he would smash my head with a single swing. He glared straight at me as he spoke his hateful words, saying, "Hey, kid, welcome to the party." And then he laughed aloud, his cruel bellow filling up the room. To my horror, I watched him advance with pure malice in his eyes, approaching my helpless mother whilst raising his club and preparing to swing. "Leave her alone," I cried out in panic. To my surprise, Kane took notice, lowering the club and turning his attention back to me. "So, kid, you want to go first? Be my guest." What happened next is something of a blur in my memory. I do recall Kane charging forward, screaming like a berserker, his club raised and ready to smash into my skull. I acted on instinct, holding the kitchen knife out before me in a desperate attempt to defend myself. Kane hit me like a ton of bricks, his club swinging, missing my head by mere centimeters. I got knocked over, my small body almost crushed under his huge frame. I felt hot blood against my skin, spraying all over my face, and for a brief moment, I feared it was my own. But when Kane rolled over, I saw the knife embedded in his chest. His eyes were full of shock and pain as he grabbed the knife's handle, unsuccessfully attempting to pull it out of his ribcage. Next, his eyes rolled over and his mouth filled up with blood, and he began to choke. I didn't dwell over the bloody scene, instead jumping to my feet and running to help my parents. My mother's eyes were shut, and so I feared the worst, but when I frantically checked her pulse, I was relieved to confirm that she was alive. My guess was that she had been passed out. I removed her gag and went to untie her, but just then I heard my father's voice. He'd regained consciousness and was trying to talk through his gag. Fearing he was in pain, I went to his aid, removing the gag to let him talk. I remember how he looked at me with a combination of disappointment and terror in his eyes, and what he said was this: "My God, what have you done?" I stood there in shocked disbelief, staring into my father's eyes as I tried to understand the meaning behind his words. I was baffled and also furious, my blood still up after a violent encounter with Kane. Unable to control my fury, I lashed out in an angry tirade. "What the hell do you mean?" I shouted. "I just saved your damn life." My father shook his head, blood-covered, speaking down to me in a condescending voice I come to resent so much. "You don't get it, kid. There are forces at play beyond your understanding. Now, untie me so I can clear up this mess." His words were increasing my anger. All the lies I'd been told, all the time I'd been locked up. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was filled with defiance, and suddenly I knew what I had to do. I walked away from my father, leaving him tied to the chair and ignoring his pleas. Instead, I walked back over to Kane's limp body, noting how he had stopped breathing, his eyes having closed for the last time as his dark blood stained our wood floor. I didn't dwell on the killing I had just committed, instead focusing fully on the task at hand. I reached out for the makeshift club, using all my strength to pull it from his cold, dead hand. Holding the weapon in triumph, I nodded defiantly at my father, seeing the fear in his eyes. For a moment, I think he really thought I would use the club on him, but that was never my intention. Instead, I confidently marched through the lounge, proceeding to the screen of the back room, which was currently projecting an image of a pristine desert scene. My dad must have realized my true plan as he screamed after me, shouting, "Don't do it! Don't do it! You have no idea what you're dealing with." I didn't listen. Enough was enough. I'd spent too long watching these shadows, and now I would finally break free from my chains. I could hear my father's cries and struggles as I approached the false window, raising my club ready to strike. I experienced a rush of adrenaline as I took the first swing, smashing the club down against the screen, seeing the artificial image falter ever so slightly as it struck. I repeated the violent act, striking the surface again and again, until finally the screen cracked and the projected scene began to flicker. The material was tougher than I thought, but I had no intention of giving up. I raised my club once again, swinging with all my might and smashing it hard against the screen. Suddenly, the image disappeared, being replaced by darkness, or more specifically, a dark, flowing water. In that moment, I experienced a wave of icy terror running through me, and I began to regret my decision, but it was too late to walk away. I stared into the dark abyss in a state of disbelief, noting how there was a wall of water in front of me, sealed behind a thick glass or some other type of transparent material. It was like we were trapped inside of a reverse goldfish bowl, but how is this possible? I took no notice of my father's screams and struggles as I stood there, completely mesmerized by what I saw. But the greatest shock was still to come. They came out of the darkness so suddenly. 3 creatures, animals of indeterminable species, their large bodies glowing in the dark water as they swam towards the glass. I'd never seen a squid or an octopus in the flesh, only in pictures and on film, but this was the closest comparison to what I could draw. Before me swam a trio of monstrous, giant squid-like creatures, with protruding and flapping tentacles, fluorescent skin, and huge saucer-like eyes with dark black pupils at the center. On the surface, they appeared to be mere beasts, but when I looked closer, I swore I could see an intelligence in the way they moved and observed. Once again, I found myself frozen in fear, unable to avert my gaze from these inexplicable monsters. Floating just on the other side of the glass. Suddenly, I heard a crashing sound behind me, and my father's voice screaming, "Get away from there!" He rushed towards me, physically tackling me to the ground. I looked up just in time to see the creatures quickly swimming away from the window, leaving only a dark water behind them. And then, a moment later, pandemonium broke out, as suddenly as the entire house was flooded with a blinding light, and I was deafened by a piercing siren. My father lay on top of me, shielding me from the chaos. But still, I felt a pressure building inside my head as my senses were overwhelmed, and then the darkness took me. I awoke sometime later in my own bed, and for a fleeting moment, I thought that it had all been a horrible nightmare. But then I felt the ache in my arms and the bruises on my body, and I knew it was all real. I adjusted my eyes to survey the bedroom, and I was surprised to see my father sitting at the end of my bed, dutifully watching over me. His head was bandaged as a result of the injury he'd suffered as Cain's hand. I expected him to be angry at me because I'd gone against him, but instead, he looked sad and despondent. He nodded as I sat up in bed, like he'd been waiting for me to wake up. "How are you feeling, kid?" he asked sympathetically. "I'm okay, I think," I answered groggily. "Where's Mom?" "She's resting. I gave her a sedative to help her sleep. It's hit her hard, everything that's happened." He trailed off, breaking eye contact momentarily. "And Cain?" I asked, barely disguising the anger in my voice. My father took a deep breath before replying. "Dead. They took his body away." "They?" I repeated scornfully. "They're real then, those monsters I saw. horrible sea creatures or whatever the hell they are. My father nodded his head solemnly before confirming that I already knew. Yeah, kid, they're real. Not only that, but the creatures you saw are our benefactors, or perhaps a better description would be owners. I simultaneously experienced a surge of both excitement and fear. What my father was telling me was almost unbelievable, and I had so many unanswered questions. Owners? What the hell are you talking about? What are those things? My father shrugged his shoulders. Truthfully, I don't know. Your mother and I remember fragments of our past lives, but we don't recall how we came to be here. Your mother believes we're in hell, and the things outside are demons. I disagree. I believe our captors came from an alien world and possess intelligence and technology vast superior to our own. I think they're keeping us locked up here to study us, or maybe this whole setup was a version of a zoo, come to see the Homo sapiens in their traditional... I literally could not believe what I was hearing. My mind was racing and my heart beating fast in my chest. I vividly remember Plato in that very moment, as my entire world just turned upside down. Clearly, I'd been living in a dark cave, and now suddenly I'd been exposed to the terrible light. But I couldn't understand how my father, if that's indeed what he was, could be so passive and accepting of our situation. Why? I exclaimed in disbelief. Why would you accept this? They're keeping you as a pet locked up, and you do nothing? What else can I do? He snapped back, with no more than a hint of anger now evident in his voice. They have total control over us, the food we eat, the air we breathe, the power of life and death over the three of us. And, for the most part, we have a good life here. A good life? I shot back. We almost died last night. They sent in that maniac Kane, and he attacked us? What was that about? Entertainment for our owners? My father shook his head and lowered his gaze. When he spoke, I could hear the self-doubt and shame in his voice. That was a mistake. They shouldn't have sent him here. It's like when they put a rogue tiger in the pen and it attacks the other cats. But they wouldn't have let him actually hurt us. They would have stopped him. I lost my mind at this, jumping up from my bed angrily to confront him. I stopped him. I saved you both. He didn't seem to be listening to me, instead muttering repeatedly under his breath. A man must sacrifice for his entire family, he said. I decided to confront the final elephant in the room. You're not my real father, and she's not my real mother. I've always known it, deep down. It's all been a lie. Suddenly, he looked up at me, and I could see the hurt in his eyes. His voice was filled with emotion as he spoke his next words. We're the only parents you'll ever have, kid. And we care about you no matter what you think of us. You're still young, but it's time you'll understand. I will never accept this, I explained defiantly. You don't have any choice, he replied. Tomorrow, they'll wipe your memory, and all of this will seem like nothing more than a bad dream. Your mind will continue to reject your environment for a time, but in the end, you'll continue to accept what you can't change. Believe me when I say, kid, ignorance is bliss. With that, he marched out of the room, shutting the door behind him and leaving me alone with my thoughts. Right now, I'm telling you this story in the full knowledge that I soon may not be able to remember any part of it. And part of me is grateful. I don't want to remember Cain or the knife I plunged into his heart. And I dread to think of those monstrosities lurking on the other side of these walls, watching everything we do and plotting new and imaginative ways to torment us. This is my digital message in a bottle. The likelihood is that no one will ever hear my account, and even if they do, they'll never believe me. Still, I hold out the slimmest hope that somehow this message will make its way home, and I pray someone will come to my rescue. I don't want to spend the rest of my life here, living in constant ignorance and fear, like a slave chained up inside a cave. Please help me before it's too late.